aired baseball cap, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his face. As Charles studied his reflection, his mind wandered to the journey that had brought him here. From humble beginnings in a predominantly black neighborhood, Charles had clawed his way up through grit, determination, and sheer business acumen. His chain of upscale retail stores, Johnson's Luxe, had become synonymous with quality, luxury, and exclusivity. Each storefront was a testament to his triumph, a beacon of hope for those who, like him, dared to dream of rising above systemic barriers and societal oppression. Yet, Charles had come to realize that success carried with it a responsibility that was easy to overlook. Lately, troubling reports had begun to cross his desk, accounts of discrimination, of black customers being judged not by the content of their character but by the color of their skin. One name kept appearing in those complaints: Paul Smith, the manager of the flagship store. Paul had impressive sales figures, but the allegations against him were serious, claims of dismissive and discriminatory behavior towards black customers, of making them feel unwelcome and less than. Charles considered firing Paul outright, but something in him resisted. He needed to see it for himself. He needed to understand what had taken root in his stores. And so, the idea for an undercover operation was born. Charles had always believed in leading from the front, in understanding every aspect of his business, and if there was rot in his organization, he intended to root it out personally. As he finalized his disguise, Charles took a deep breath. He picked up an old, battered wallet, part of his costume, and glanced at a faded photo tucked inside. It showed a much younger version of himself, standing proudly in front of his first small shop. That memory of hope, ambition, and unyielding determination steeled his resolve. "Time to remember where you came from," Charles muttered to himself. With a final glance in the mirror, Charles Johnson, the millionaire entrepreneur, the respected businessman, disappeared. In his place stood just another black man, indistinguishable from the thousands of others walking the streets of the city, a face that too often went unseen, unheard, and disrespected. As he stepped out of his apartment and merged into the city's bustling streets, Charles could feel it, the shift in the way people regarded him. The indifferent gazes that slid past him, the subtle looks of suspicion. He was reminded, in the rawest way, of how deeply skin color influenced perception, how black people, like him, became invisible in a world that worshipped wealth but feared them. The walk to his flagship store took longer than usual. Without his chauffeur-driven car, Charles had to navigate public transportation, rubbing shoulders with the very people he intended his store to serve. Finally, he stood before the gleaming facade of Johnson's Luxe. The windows displayed the latest in luxury fashion, each item carefully curated to exude aspiration. Charles took a deep breath, steeling himself, and pushed open the heavy glass doors, the chime announcing his entrance. As he stepped inside, he could immediately feel the shift in atmosphere. The air grew cold. The eyes of sales associates, usually filled with warmth when a potential sale walked in, narrowed with judgment. Charles moved through the store, his experienced gaze taking in every detail. The plush carpets, the carefully arranged displays, it all spoke of wealth, of exclusivity. To his left, a sales associate showered attention upon a well-dressed white couple, practically falling over herself to assist them. To his right, a young black woman, neatly dressed, was being ignored entirely as she browsed the handbags. The disparity was glaring, and it made Charles's stomach churn. He approached the display of luxury watches, and there, not far from him, was Paul Smith. Paul was everything Charles remembered: tall, impeccably dressed, a smile that seemed to charm everyone around him. But when Paul's eyes fell on Charles, that smile vanished, replaced by a look of thinly veiled contempt. "Can I help you?" Paul asked, his voice cold, condescending. Charles, staying in character, smiled politely. "Yes, I was hoping to take a look at one of these watches." "It's for a special occasion." Paul raised an eyebrow, skepticism evident. "These timepieces start at $5,000, he said, emphasizing the price. "I'm not sure that's within your budget." Charles felt a flare of anger, but he kept his voice steady. "I've been saving up," he said softly. "Could I see that one, please?" He pointed to an elegant piece. Paul sighed, the sound full of disdain, but reluctantly opened the display case. As Charles reached out to take the watch, Paul pulled it back slightly. "Your hands are clean, right?" he sneered. Charles ignored the insult, examining the watch as Paul's impatient gaze bore into him. Around them, other employees had taken notice, some looking uncomfortable, others watching with amusement. Paul smirked and added loudly, "We do have more affordable options at our outlet across town. Might be more your speed." Charles looked up, meeting Paul's gaze steadily. "Someone like me?" he asked, his voice quiet. Paul's smile was cold. "You know what I mean. We cater to a certain clientele here, I'm sure you understand. Racism and classism, now laid bare." Charles felt a deep sadness mingling with his anger. How many potential customers had been driven away by this attitude? How many dreams crushed by such prejudice? "I see," Charles said, handing the watch back. "And if I wanted to speak to the owner? About this policy of yours?" Paul laughed, a harsh sound. "Mr. Johnson has better things to do than deal with people like you," he scoffed. "Now, unless you're planning on buying something, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We can't have you disturbing our real customers." As Paul turned away dismissively, Charles caught sight of his own reflection in a nearby mirror, not just his own face, but the faces of countless black individuals who had stood in this very spot, their dignity assaulted, their humanity questioned. He made a silent vow, this would end, not just for himself, but for every black person who had ever been judged, devalued, or humiliated because of their skin color. With a quiet dignity that Paul could never understand, Charles turned and walked towards the exit. But this was far from over, the real reckoning was yet to come. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Charles stood before his closet, selecting one of his finest suits, his armor. As he tied his silk tie and slipped on his handcrafted shoes, he steeled himself for the day ahead. Today, he would return to the store, not as a faceless black man, but as Charles Johnson, the owner. He arrived at the flagship store, and the soft chime of the door might as well have been a trumpet blast. Employees straightened, their faces transforming into masks of professional cheerfulness. And there, at the center of it all, was Paul. He hurried forward, his demeanor now dripping with false charm. "Mr. Johnson, what a pleasure. If we'd known you were coming." Charles held up a hand, silencing him. "No need, Paul. I'm just here to observe." A flicker of unease crossed Paul's face, but he quickly masked it. "Of course, sir. Let me give you a tour. I was just telling the staff this morning about how we've increased our sales by focusing on our premium clientele." Charles nodded, letting Paul lead him around. "The right kind of people?" he asked, voice neutral. "Exactly. We can't have just anyone coming in and disturbing our high-end customers. Why, just yesterday, there was this scruffy man trying to touch our finest watch, asking to speak to the owner." Paul laughed, oblivious to the dangerous glint in Charles's eyes. They had made a full circuit of the store. Charles stopped at the entrance, turning to face Paul. "Tell me about that man," Charles said, his voice carrying across the now silent store. Paul, still grinning, described the vagrant. With each word, his smile faltered, a dawning horror filling his eyes as he realized his mistake. It sounds, Charles said softly, like you were describing me. The silence was absolute. Paul turned pale, stammering, Mr. Johnson, I didn't realize. That's the problem, Paul, Charles interrupted. You shouldn't treat anyone that way, regardless of who they are. He turned to address the staff, his voice calm but steely. This isn't just about me. It's about every black person who walked into this store and was made to feel less than. This stops now. Charles looked around, seeing the mix of emotions, shame, discomfort, understanding. We will be implementing mandatory sensitivity training, starting today, he announced. And Paul, you have a choice, walk away, or be part of the change. Paul swallowed, nodding, tears brimming in his eyes. I want to change, Mr. Johnson. I want to be better. Charles nodded. Then let this be the beginning. He turned to the rest of the team. We have work to do, to become the kind of company that respects everyone who walks through these doors. Months later, Charles stood outside the flagship store, watching a diverse group of customers come and go. He saw smiles, genuine warmth. Inside, Paul greeted a young black man with respect, no different from any other client. And Charles knew that change was possible, one step at a time, one person at a time.